Some people's lives are loud from the outside, but completely silent on the inside. That was the puzzle that stayed with me the first time I really noticed it. I was sitting in a small café, the kind with wobbly wooden tables and soft music that no one is really listening to. Outside, the traffic moved in a familiar rhythm, impatient and predictable. Inside, everyone was bent over a screen, quietly occupied. I was halfway through a cup of coffee when I suddenly wondered, at what point does a life become too loud to hear your own thoughts? The question didn't come from nowhere. At the next table sat a man everyone in that cafe seemed to recognize. I won't name him, and it doesn't really matter who he was. What mattered was the way people's eyes followed him, the way a small wave of excitement went through the room when he walked in. Phones appeared, whispers passed between tables. Success, you could say, had entered the cafe. He, on the other hand, just looked tired. Not exhausted in a dramatic way, but gently worn out, like someone who has been speaking for a very long time and suddenly wants to rest his voice. When the waiter asked for a photo, he smiled kindly and agreed. When a woman came over to say she loved his work, he listened and thanked her with genuine warmth. But when he was left alone again, his face shifted back into something else, something quieter. His eyes went to the window and stayed there, as if the busy street outside was somehow easier to look at than everything happening inside the room. Watching him, a sentence formed in my mind. Success is loud, peace is quiet. I don't know why that line stayed with me. Maybe because it didn't just seem true about him. It felt true about me too, and about people I knew. The volume of our lives had been steadily rising for years. Notifications, expectations, ambitions, images of what we thought we should be. We were all turning the dial up, hoping that louder would mean happier. Yet somewhere along the way, many of us had misplaced something simple. The sense that we could sit with ourselves, alone and unentertained, and still feel whole. That day, between sips of coffee, I realized I had been chasing a noisy life without ever asking what it was drowning out. For most of my 20s, I believed that the proof of a good life was how easily other people could see it. It wasn't fame, not in any grand sense, but I wanted a kind of local success. A respected job, visible achievements, a social circle that looked full from the outside. I measured progress in how many people knew my name in certain rooms, how often someone would say, "Oh, I've heard of you." I worked late, volunteered for extra tasks, accepted every invitation that might possibly be good for my career. On paper, it was working. Titles changed, responsibilities grew, my schedule filled itself. The noise kept increasing, emails, meetings, calls, endless conversations where everyone spoke a lot but said very little. There were after-work gatherings where we repeated the same stories about being so busy and laughed as if it were a badge of honor. But under all that noise, something small and persistent began to push through. It would appear in quiet moments, on the train home when I stared at my reflection in the dark window, or on Sunday mornings when the city hadn't fully woken up yet. The question was always the same. If no one could see what you're doing, would you still want this life? I didn't like that question. I had spent years crafting an image of who I was becoming. To admit that I wasn't sure about it felt like betraying my own effort. So I ignored the question, the way you might ignore an ache in your shoulder, hoping it would go away if you just kept moving. But it didn't go away, it only waited. One evening, after another long day full of small urgencies, I came home to an apartment that felt strangely unfamiliar. It wasn't messy, it was simply neglected in a subtle way. A pile of books I had promised myself I'd read when I had time. A guitar in the corner gathering dust. A small plant by the window, half forgotten, stretching quietly toward the light without any help from me. I sat down on the couch, phone in hand, ready to distract myself again. But a simple thing happened. My phone slipped from my hand onto the cushion and I was too tired to pick it up. So I just sat there. No music, no screen, no tasks, just the sound of the refrigerator humming and the muted traffic outside. It was in that stillness that something honest surfaced. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had done something solely because it made me feel calm, not because it moved me forward, impressed someone, or built my future. The last several years had been a long, continuous performance. Not fake exactly, but edited. I was always aware of an invisible audience, even when no one else was around. That night, the old question returned without any disguise. If no one were watching, how would you live? I didn't have an answer, but for the first time, I didn't push the question away. I let it sit beside me quietly. The shift didn't happen suddenly. Real life rarely changes all at once. It began with small acts of defiance against my own habits. I started leaving my phone in another room for an hour each evening. The first few days, I felt like I had lost a sense. I would reach for a device that wasn't there and feel a small jolt of panic. What if I missed something important? What if someone needed me? What if a chance opportunity slipped by? But then slowly, the panic softened into something else: space. With nothing demanding my attention, I found myself listening to sounds I usually ignored. The distant conversation of neighbors, the creak of the building as it settled, my own breathing. I noticed how often I moved from one task to another without ever finishing a thought. It was uncomfortable at first, like standing in a quiet room after being at a concert, hearing the ringing in your ears. Around the same time, I began saying no more often. Not dramatically. I didn't quit my job or disappear from my life. I simply stopped saying yes automatically. I skipped a few social events that I knew would leave me drained. I pulled back from conversations that were about keeping up appearances rather than sharing anything real. I chose a slow walk home over another drink at a loud bar. Of course, people noticed in small ways. "You've been quiet lately," some said. "Everything okay?" It was a reasonable question. In a world that equates visibility with wellness, quiet can feel suspicious. But I realized that for the first time in a long while, my quiet was not a symptom of something wrong. It was a sign that I was trying to listen. Listen to what, though? That took longer to understand. At first, the quiet exposed things I had managed to hide from myself behind the noise. Old grief I hadn't fully faced, disappointments I had smoothed over with busyness, fears about not being enough unless I was constantly proving myself. None of it was pleasant. There were evenings when the silence felt heavy, when it would have been so much easier to drown it out with another project, another distraction, another night out. But there was something underneath all of that discomfort. A faint awareness that I was finally coming into contact with the actual texture of my life, not just its surface. One afternoon, sitting alone in a park, I watched a family by the pond. A child was throwing pieces of bread to the ducks with intense concentration. The mother, clearly tired, was watching with a soft smile, not because anyone else was there to see how patient or loving she was, but because she was simply present with this small, private moment. No applause, no audience, just a tiny piece of life unfolding in complete anonymity. I remember thinking, this is the opposite of the life I've been building. Not smaller, just quieter, not less meaningful, perhaps even more. And something in me quietly wanted that. Sometimes people imagine that choosing a quieter life means rejecting success or walking away from everything you've worked for. That wasn't what happened to me. I didn't suddenly stop caring about doing good work. I didn't lose my ambition or my curiosity. What changed was the direction those things were facing. Before, my energy had been turned outward. I looked to other people to tell me who I was, how much I mattered, whether I was on the right path. Their approval or disapproval acted like a weather report for my self-worth. On good days, I felt sunny. On bad days, I felt like a storm anyone could walk out on. In the quieter phase that followed, I began to turn that attention inward, not in a selfish way, but in a more honest one. I asked myself simple questions. What kind of work makes me lose track of time? Who do I feel most like myself with? What activities leave me calmer instead of emptier? If today were my last ordinary day, how would I want to spend its ordinary moments? The answers weren't grand or dramatic. They were small, almost plain. I felt alive when I was learning something new that mattered to me, not just to my resume. I felt at ease with people I could sit in silence with without any pressure to impress. I felt restored after long walks, reading, cooking simple meals, writing thoughts no one might ever read. None of these things would look particularly impressive from the outside. They wouldn't generate stories people would retell at parties, but they felt real. They felt like mine. In time, this quiet noticing began to rearrange my life in subtle but real ways. I chose projects at work that aligned more with what I found meaningful, even if they were less visible. I let go of the urge to always have the most exciting answer when someone asked what I was doing lately. I stopped trying to appear busier than I was. Sometimes, when asked about my plans for the weekend, I would simply say, "I'm resting," and let that be enough. There was a kind of humility in that, and also a kind of freedom. I no longer needed every part of my life to signal success. I wanted it to reflect peace. Around this time, I thought again of the man in the café, the one whose outer life was so loud, yet whose eyes had been fixed on something distant and quiet. I remembered reading long ago that some people, at the height of what the world calls success, choose to step back. Not because they can't handle the attention, but because they realize attention is not the same as meaning. For them, the turning point is often not a crisis or a scandal. It's a simple recognition. I can keep feeding this machine, or I can feed my soul. And sometimes, gently, they begin to choose the latter. That thought comforted me. It suggested that it wasn't naive or weak to want a different kind of life. It was simply another form of maturity, to recognize that being widely known is not the same as being deeply alive. As I made peace with that idea, something shifted in how I saw other people too. I began to notice the quiet lives around me that I'd previously overlooked. The older neighbor who tended her balcony plants with care, who once told me that her happiest moment each day was when the first bird landed near her railing. The bus driver who greeted everyone who stepped onto his bus as if they were old acquaintances. The colleague who never fought for the spotlight, but was always the first to help when someone was struggling. There was a depth to these people that didn't announce itself. You had to slow down to see it. Their peace wasn't made of spectacular experiences. It was made of simple, consistent alignment between what they valued and how they moved through the world. It occurred to me then that success, in the usual sense, is designed to be seen. It thrives on feedback, recognition, and noise. Peace, on the other hand, is content being invisible. It exists wholly within, whether or not anyone else notices. And so the question became, which did I want at the center of my life? Of course, the world didn't change around me. The culture of constant display and endless comparison remained. I still lived in a time where people could broadcast every second of their day if they chose to. But my relationship with all that noise softened. I stopped feeling the same urgency to respond to everything immediately. Messages could wait a little longer. Not every invitation had to be accepted. I turned off more notifications than I turned on. I chose slower forms of communication, longer conversations in person, fewer fragmented exchanges online. I also started protecting small rituals of quiet as if they were appointments with someone important, because in a way they were. Morning tea without checking the news, an evening walk without headphones, a short stretch of time before bed to write down a few thoughts from the day, not for anyone else to read, but just to see what was happening inside my own mind. These were not dramatic changes. No one would make a movie about them. But over months and years, they did something significant. They made my inner life audible again. In that space, I could notice when I was moving too fast, when I was agreeing to things out of fear instead of desire, when I was slipping back into performing rather than living. I could also notice the small, good moments that used to rush past me. Laughter shared for no reason, the feel of warm water on tired hands, the way light fell across a quiet room in the late afternoon. This, I realized, was what peace actually looked like. Not a permanent state of bliss, not an escape from all difficulty, but a steady, gentle awareness that allowed life to be felt instead of just managed. Looking back, it might sound as if I turned my back on ambition altogether, but that isn't true. I still care about growing, creating, contributing. The difference now is this. My drive is no longer fueled primarily by the need to be seen, but by the desire to be aligned. Aligned with what I value. Aligned with what feels honest to my particular life. Aligned with the simple truth that I have only so many days, and I would like them to be lived, not merely displayed. Sometimes opportunities arise that could make my life louder. Projects that would bring more attention, roles that would place me more obviously in the spotlight. I don't automatically refuse them, but I don't automatically accept them either. I sit with them in that quiet space I've learned to protect and ask, will this deepen my life or just amplify it? If the answer leans toward amplification without depth, I'm more willing now to let it pass. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the kind of life I'm trying to build. Other times, opportunities appear that look small from the outside but feel large on the inside. Time to help a friend through a hard season, a chance to learn something I've always been curious about, an invitation to spend an afternoon in unhurried conversation. These, I've learned, are worth saying yes to, even if they don't fit neatly into the story of success. Because in the end, the story that matters most is the one you tell yourself when the room is quiet and no one else is listening. Every so often now, I return to that cafe or one like it. I sit by a window and watch people move through their days, carrying visible and invisible weights. Some are rushing, some are drifting, some are quietly grounded. I don't pretend to know their stories, but I recognize certain patterns because I've lived them. I think of the man whose public life was so loud and whose private gaze was so far away. I don't know what choices he has made since that day. Perhaps he continued on the same path. Perhaps he, too, gradually chose more silence, more space, more room to breathe. We rarely know the private shifts in other people's hearts. What I do know is this: every one of us, regardless of how ordinary or extraordinary our lives appear, will eventually face some version of the same question. Is the noise around me helping me hear myself, or is it drowning me out? For some, the answer will lead them to chase bigger stages and brighter lights for a while, until they discover their own threshold. For others, it will draw them towards smaller, steadier lives that don't impress many but feel deeply right. There is no single correct path, there is only the honest one. For me, the honesty lay in recognizing that I had confused being noticed with being fulfilled. I had treated external success as the main measure of a life well lived, without realizing that the quiet moments, those unphotographed, unreported pieces of time, were the ones that ultimately shaped my sense of peace. Now, when life gets noisy again, as it inevitably does, I try not to resent it. Noise, after all, is part of living. There are busy seasons, joyful celebrations, moments when the volume naturally rises. The goal isn't to escape all of that. It's simply to remember that underneath the loudest days, there must remain a place of stillness we can return to. A place where no applause can reach us, no criticism either. A place where our worth is not negotiated but quietly known. In that place, success and failure both lose some of their sharp edges. They become experiences we move through, not definitions we cling to. We begin to see that the life we really long for is not built out of moments that impress others, but out of moments that feel true to who we are when everything else falls silent. So if you ever find yourself in a room full of noise, looking out a window and feeling something unnamed tugging at you, pay attention to it. That gentle pull might be your own life asking for a different kind of attention. Not louder, not grander, just more sincere. Because in the end, the most enduring form of success is being able to sit with yourself in quiet and feel at home. Success is loud, peace is quiet. And somewhere between the two, each of us is invited to choose the life we will actually live, not just the one the world can see.